Dawn broke at 6:42 a.m. on the morning of February 26, 1945. George Wahlen, a Navy pharmacist's mate second class, pressed himself into a crater carved from volcanic ash on Iwo Jima. Just 20 years old, barely 5 weeks into his life as a combat corpsman, he watched his platoon push forward through a hellscape of incoming Japanese mortar fire toward the island's 3rd airfield. Around him, the math was brutal. 14 Marines from his company had already been killed. The Japanese had turned Hill 362 Alpha into a fortress, 500 caves, all interconnected, turning every inch of American progress into a transaction paid in blood. 7 days prior, Wahlen had come ashore with Fox Company, 2nd Battalion, 26th Marines. The black volcanic sand seemed to infiltrate everything: uniforms, weapons, skin. The island's sulfur fumes scorched his lungs with every breath, but nothing compared to the sound that haunted every advance, the desperate cry of "Corpsman." The 5th Marine Division had been sold a lie. General William Rupertus himself had promised them a 4-day campaign. Quick, decisive, over before anyone knew what happened. That was before they understood what Colonel Kunio Nakagawa had engineered into the volcanic bedrock of this island: underground medical facilities, ammunition storage buried 20 feet beneath the surface, machine gun emplacements positioned to create devastating crossfire patterns. By the time February 26th arrived, the 5th Marine Division had bled 3,000 men. Corpsmen were falling faster than the Marines they desperately tried to save. Japanese snipers had decoded the system: spot the red crosses painted on helmets, listen for someone shouting "Corpsman," then aim for whoever responds. Wahlen had already put his hands on 43 wounded men in just 1 week. Penetrating chest trauma, limbs severed by explosions, burns from flamethrower backblast accidents. He hauled 30 pounds of medical equipment on his back: morphine syrettes, sulfanilamide powder, battle dressings, plasma, while the Marines around him carried rifles. The rules were crystal clear: corpsmen went unarmed. The Geneva Convention supposedly protected medical personnel from deliberate targeting. The Japanese had different ideas about Geneva. They hunted corpsmen with calculated precision. 14 Navy Hospital Corpsmen in Wahlen's battalion alone had already been killed in action. Another 22 had been wounded badly enough to require evacuation. At 7:15 a.m., Fox Company pushed forward again. Wahlen maintained a 20-yard gap behind the assault element, scanning constantly for casualties. The terrain fought them at every turn. Volcanic ridges and ravines transformed each advance into a deadly maze where Marines vanished into gullies and simply never reappeared. Then the mortars began their work. Japanese observers positioned on the high ground enjoyed perfect visibility over the battlefield. The first round impacted 30 feet ahead of Wahlen's position. The second struck 15 feet behind him. The third landed directly in front of a rifleman named Corporal James McKenna. Wahlen didn't think. He ran. This was exactly what they'd drilled into him at Camp Pendleton. This was why he'd volunteered for the Fleet Marine Force instead of accepting a comfortable hospital posting in California. McKenna was alive, bleeding from multiple wounds. Wahlen dropped beside him, and his hands began moving automatically. Sulfanilamide powder on the wounds, battle dressings packed tight to control the bleeding. Then he heard it, the sound every corpsman had learned to dread: the hollow thump of a Japanese grenade launcher firing. Want to know what happened when that grenade hit? Go ahead and smash that like button. It's how we get these forgotten stories in front of more people who need to hear them. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. Let's get back to Wahlen. The grenade landed 3 feet from where Wahlen knelt working. He watched it bounce once against the volcanic ash. Maybe 2 seconds to make a decision. McKenna couldn't move on his own. The nearest cover sat 15 feet away across completely exposed ground. Wahlen faced a choice that would define everything: stay and die alongside McKenna, or run and spend the rest of his life knowing he'd abandoned a wounded Marine. The grenade detonated. The blast hurled Wahlen sideways into the crater wall. His ears screamed with ringing, his vision whited out completely. Then pain arrived. Shrapnel had ripped through his left eye and cheekbone. Blood poured down his face, mixing with volcanic ash and sulfur residue into a grotesque paste. McKenna was still breathing. The grenade had missed him by inches, But now they were both bleeding in an exposed position with Japanese mortars continuing to rain down around them. Wahlen's medical training overrode everything else. His left eye wasn't functioning properly. The pain was beyond description. But McKenna's wounds were worse. Arterial bleeding from his leg that would kill him in 3 minutes without a tourniquet. Wahlen reached into his medical kit with trembling hands. His left eye had gone dark and wet, useless now, but his right eye still worked, his hands still worked, and McKenna needed immediate help. He got the tourniquet secured on McKenna's leg at 7:23 a.m. Then he packed the remaining wounds with sulfanilamide powder and battle dressings. The entire time, Japanese machine guns raked the crater with fire. Bullets cracked overhead. More mortars fell 50 yards away, walking closer. Other corpsmen witnessed what had happened. Pharmacist's mate Third Class Robert Hayes crawled forward to assist. He took one look at Wahlen's face and declared they needed immediate evacuation for both casualties. Standard procedure. Get them back to the battalion aid station. Wahlen refused.
Marines were still advancing toward Airfield No. 3. Fox Company was pushing into the most fortified sector on the entire island. Every corpsman mattered. Hayes could take McKenna back to safety. Wahlen was staying on the line. Hayes argued for 30 seconds, then surrendered the point. You couldn't order a corpsman to leave the front line. Everyone here was a volunteer. Everyone had chosen this. If Wahlen wanted to remain half-blind and bleeding, that was his decision to make. They loaded McKenna onto a stretcher at 7:35 a.m. 4 Marines carried him back through the volcanic ash while Hayes provided security. Wahlen remained in his crater, temporarily blind in one eye, watching Fox Company advance through hell. By 8 a.m., the adrenaline began wearing thin. The pain in his face became impossible to ignore. His left eye socket felt like someone had injected molten metal directly into it. The sulfanilamide powder he'd dumped on his own wounds burned like concentrated acid, but Fox Company was still moving forward. Marines were still taking hits. At 8:15 a.m., another cry, "Corpsman!" This time the call came from an adjacent platoon that had lost their own corpsman to a sniper 20 minutes earlier. Wahlen climbed out of his crater and ran toward the voice. His depth perception had vanished completely. He kept stumbling on the uneven terrain, but he could still carry plasma. He could still pack wounds. He could still do the job. The wounded Marine was Private First Class Thomas O'Brien from Pittsburgh, shrapnel in his chest and abdomen, sucking chest wound. Without immediate treatment, O'Brien would drown in his own blood. Wahlen got an occlusive dressing over the chest wound. Then he started an IV line for plasma. His hands moved through the procedures on autopilot now. 6 months of field medical drills at Camp Pendleton. Every scenario they'd practiced in California was now happening in real life. While Wahlen worked, Japanese mortars found their range again. First round, 40 feet away. Second round, 20 feet away. The third was coming straight for O'Brien's position, and this time, Wahlen couldn't see it coming from his blind side. The explosion lifted both men off the ground. Wahlen landed hard on his back in the volcanic ash. This second explosion had struck closer than the first. New pain erupted across his lower back and shoulders. Hot metal had punched through his dungarees and buried itself in muscle tissue. O'Brien was unconscious but still breathing. The plasma line had been torn loose. Blood soaked through the chest dressing. Wahlen needed to restart the IV immediately. He tried to sit up. His back screamed in protest. Something was wrong with his spine. Not severed, he could still feel his legs, but every movement sent lightning bolts of agony through his torso. Other Marines had witnessed the explosion. 2 riflemen crawled forward to help. They wanted to carry both casualties back to the battalion aid station together, Wahlen and O'Brien both. Get them evacuated before the next mortar barrage arrived. Wahlen refused again. O'Brien needed immediate evacuation. But Wahlen could still work. His legs functioned. His right eye functioned. His hands functioned. That was sufficient. The Marines stared at him like he'd lost his mind. Blood covered his face from the eye wound. Now blood soaked his back from fresh shrapnel. He could barely sit upright, yet he was arguing to remain on the front line. They carried O'Brien back at 8:40 a.m. Wahlen stayed in the crater, adding back wounds to his growing inventory of injuries. He dumped sulfanilamide powder over his shoulders, reaching as far as he could. Then he wrapped battle dressings around his torso and kept moving. By 9 a.m., Fox Company had gained 200 yards. They'd reached the base of Hill 362 Alpha. Every cave entrance vomited machine gun fire. Every ravine concealed Japanese soldiers armed with grenades. The casualty rate was climbing exponentially. Wahlen treated 6 more Marines between 9 a.m. and 9:30 a.m., mostly shrapnel wounds, one traumatic amputation from a mine, another sucking chest wound. His plasma supply was running dangerously low. His medical kit was nearly empty, but he kept working. The corpsmen in adjacent battalions were being annihilated. One battalion had lost 68% of its medical personnel in just the first week. Navy Hospital Corpsmen were dying at twice the rate of the Marines they served, but they kept answering the call. Every time someone screamed, "Corpsman," someone came running. At 9:45 a.m., battalion headquarters sent word through the company commander. Captain William Chambers personally located Wahlen and gave him a direct order, not a suggestion, to head to the rear. The corpsman had been wounded twice. He needed proper medical treatment. He needed evacuation. Wahlen said he'd go after the current attack concluded. Fox Company was about to assault Hill 362 Alpha directly. They'd need every available corpsman. He'd evacuate after the hill was secured. Chambers understood he couldn't force the issue. Corpsmen weren't regular Marines. They answered to the Navy medical chain of command, and they'd all volunteered for this duty. If Wahlen wanted to die on this island, that was his choice to make. The assault on Hill 362 Alpha commenced at 10 a.m. on February 26th. Japanese defenders had spent months fortifying the position. Pillboxes covered every possible approach. Interlocking machine gun fire made movement nearly suicidal. Marines advanced 10 yards and lost men, advanced another 10 yards and lost more. Wahlen followed the assault wave. His back was on fire. His left eye was useless, but his hands still worked, and Marines were falling faster than ever. At 10:15 a.m., he reached a wounded rifleman named Corporal Stephen Martinez, then another named Private James Wilson, then 3 more Marines caught in a machine gun crossfire. He was working on the 5th casualty when someone grabbed his shoulder from behind. Another corpsman, pharmacist's mate First Class Donald Mitchell from the company headquarters element. Mitchell had been sent specifically to relieve Wahlen and force him off the line. Mitchell took one look at Wahlen's face and back and declared they were leaving immediately. No argument this time. Wahlen had done enough. He'd earned his evacuation. Time to go. But Wahlen was looking past Mitchell at something Mitchell couldn't see yet. Another group of Marines had just walked into a kill zone 200 yards ahead. Machine guns opened up. 6 Marines went down in the first 10 seconds. Japanese machine gun fire from 3 different positions converging on 100 square feet of volcanic ash. The Marines who survived dove for cover in shallow craters that offered almost no protection. Mitchell grabbed Wahlen's arm. They needed to leave now. Let other corpsmen handle this. Wahlen had given enough. Wahlen pulled free and started running toward the machine gun fire. His back screamed with every step. His vision swam. But 6 Marines were bleeding out in the open, and nobody was moving to help them. The other corpsmen were pinned down or dead. Fox Company had lost 3 medical personnel in the last hour alone. Mitchell watched Wahlen run into the kill zone and made his own decision. He followed. They reached the first casualty at 10:23 a.m. Private First Class Robert Davidson, 19 years old, from Oregon. Multiple gunshot wounds to the chest and abdomen, still conscious, still breathing but bleeding internally and deteriorating rapidly. Wahlen and Mitchell worked together. Mitchell started the plasma line. Wahlen packed the wounds. Japanese machine guns kept firing overhead. Bullets snapped through the air so close they could feel the displacement, but they kept working. They stabilized Davidson in 4 minutes. Then they moved to the next casualty, then the next. 6 wounded Marines in that kill zone. Wahlen and Mitchell treated all 6, while Japanese defenders poured fire into their position. Later, battalion records would document they spent 17 minutes in that exposed area, 17 minutes that should have killed them both. At 10:45 a.m., Marines with flamethrowers finally silenced the machine gun positions. The surviving members of Fox Company pulled back to consolidate. Battalion casualties had reached 240 men in 7 days. One rifle company had lost 72% of its original strength. Mitchell got Wahlen to the battalion aid station at 11 a.m. Navy surgeons took one look at the eye wound and the back wounds and prepped him for evacuation. They had him on a stretcher heading for the beach when Wahlen climbed off and walked back toward his company. The surgeons couldn't believe it. This corpsman had been wounded twice in 4 hours. His left eye was destroyed. Shrapnel filled his back. He could barely walk straight, yet he was refusing evacuation again and heading back to the front line. Captain Chambers discovered Wahlen's return at 11:30 a.m. He pulled the corpsman aside and asked directly, "What would it take to get you evacuated? What injury would be serious enough?" Wahlen didn't have a good answer. He just knew Fox Company was still advancing. The battle for Iwo Jima wasn't over. As long as Marines were fighting, corpsmen needed to be there. That was the job. That was what he'd signed up for. Chambers gave up trying to force the issue. He assigned Wahlen to the company command post where he could treat casualties coming through the aid station instead of running forward under fire. Safer duty, less exposed. Wahlen agreed to the compromise. For the next 5 days, Wahlen worked from the company aid station. His left eye never recovered. The socket remained swollen and painful. His back wounds grew infected despite sulfanilamide powder, but he kept treating casualties. Fox Company lost another 80 men between February 26th and March 2nd. On March 2nd, Fox Company received orders to assault the final defensive line before Kitano Point. Japanese defenders had concentrated their remaining strength in a series of caves and bunkers overlooking the northern coast. Intelligence estimated 300 enemy soldiers remained in the sector. The estimate was catastrophically wrong. There were closer to 800. The assault began at 7 a.m. on March 2nd. Within minutes, Fox Company walked into the heaviest concentration of defensive fire they'd encountered since landing on Iwo Jima. Mortars, artillery, machine guns from positions the Marines didn't know existed. Casualties mounted immediately. The company aid station filled with wounded men faster than the medical staff could process them. Wahlen worked through the chaos, stabilizing casualties for evacuation. His back was screaming, his ruined eye throbbed, but his hands kept moving through the familiar procedures. At 8:30 a.m., a Japanese mortar found the aid station. The explosion killed 2 Marines instantly and sent shrapnel through everyone within 20 feet. Wahlen took metal fragments in his lower back, the same area that had been hit 6 days earlier, new wounds layered on top of old wounds. This time the injury was serious enough that even Wahlen couldn't ignore it. The shrapnel had driven deep into muscle tissue near his spine. He couldn't stand up straight. Every movement sent shock waves of pain through his torso, but Fox Company was still in contact, and the next 24 hours would test everything Wahlen had left. Navy surgeons at the battalion aid station looked at Wahlen's new wounds and made the decision for him. This wasn't negotiable anymore. He was being evacuated to Guam. The back injury was too severe. Without proper treatment, infection would kill him within days. They put Wahlen on a stretcher at 9 a.m. on March 2nd. 4 Marines carried him toward the beach, where landing craft waited to transfer casualties to hospital ships offshore. Wahlen didn't argue this time. The pain was too intense. He'd finally hit his limit. The stretcher team made it 300 yards before Fox Company's radio operator caught up with them. Emergency traffic from the battalion commander. The assault on Kitano Point had turned into a disaster. Fox Company had taken 40% casualties in 90 minutes. Every corpsman with the forward elements was dead or wounded. They needed Wahlen back immediately. The stretcher bearers looked at each other. Then they looked at Wahlen. The corpsman was half conscious from pain and blood loss. His back wounds were still bleeding through the dressings. Taking him back to the front line was insane. Wahlen told them to turn around. Fox Company needed corpsmen. He could still work. Get him back to the company position. They carried him back at 9:30 a.m. By 10 a.m., Wahlen was back at the company aid station, treating casualties despite wounds that should have had him on a hospital ship. Other medical personnel couldn't understand it. This corpsman had been wounded twice in 6 days. Now he'd been wounded a 3rd time, but he kept refusing evacuation. The assault on Kitano Point continued throughout March 2nd. Fox Company gained 200 yards at the cost of 63 casualties. Wahlen treated 37 of them personally. Gunshot wounds, shrapnel wounds, burns from flamethrowers, traumatic amputations from mines. By nightfall on March 2nd, Fox Company had been reduced to 97 men. They'd started the Iwo Jima operation with 240. In 11 days, they'd lost nearly 60% of their personnel. The 5th Marine Division as a whole had suffered 8,000 casualties. The island still wasn't secured. Wahlen spent the night of March 2nd in agony. His back wounds had become infected. Pus leaked through the dressings. His ruined left eye socket throbbed with every heartbeat. He was running a fever, but morning would bring another assault, and Fox Company still needed corpsmen. March 3rd began at 6:30 a.m. with a Japanese artillery barrage. Enemy observers had spotted Fox Company's position during the night. High explosive shells walked through the Marine lines, killing and wounding men before they could even begin the day's advance. The assault toward Kitano Point resumed at 7 a.m. Fox Company pushed forward across 600 yards of open terrain. No cover, no concealment. Japanese defenders had perfect fields of fire from elevated positions. Every yard the Marines advanced cost blood. Wahlen followed the assault element. He could barely walk upright. The back pain was excruciating, but Marines were falling and someone had to treat them. At 7:20 a.m. he reached a wounded rifleman, then another, then 3 more caught in a machine gun crossfire. An adjacent platoon took heavy casualties at 7:45 a.m. Their corpsman had been killed 2 days earlier. They'd been operating without dedicated medical support since then. When Marines started falling, they screamed for any corpsman who could hear them. Wahlen heard. He moved toward their position across open ground swept by continuous fire. Japanese machine guns, mortars, rifle fire from a dozen hidden positions. The volcanic ash erupted in fountains as bullets impacted all around him. He reached the adjacent platoon at 8 a.m. 14 Marines were wounded, some critically. Most had been lying in the open for 20 minutes or more without treatment. Internal bleeding, arterial bleeding, sucking chest wounds. Without immediate help, half of them would die. Wahlen started working. First casualty, second casualty, third. He moved through the wounded men systematically, triaging and treating. Plasma here, battle dressings there, morphine for the ones in shock. His medical training took over completely. The pain in his back faded into background noise. Japanese defenders realized a corpsman was working in the open. Machine guns shifted fire. Mortars adjusted. Rifle fire concentrated on the one man trying to save 14 Marines. Bullets kicked up ash all around Wahlen's position. He kept working. At 8:23 a.m., a Japanese sniper fired from an elevated position 300 yards away. The bullet hit Wahlen in his right leg just below the knee. The impact spun him around and dropped him face first into the volcanic ash. His right leg wouldn't support weight anymore. The femoral artery was intact, but muscle and bone were damaged. He couldn't stand, couldn't walk, but 12 wounded Marines still needed treatment, and the nearest corpsman was 200 yards away. Wahlen started crawling. The volcanic ash was hot enough to burn exposed skin. Wahlen dragged himself forward, using his elbows and one good leg. His right leg left a trail of blood in the black sand. Every movement sent fresh waves of agony through his back wounds. But there was a wounded Marine 50 yards ahead who would die without plasma. Private First Class Kenneth Morrison, 21 years old, from Kansas. Shrapnel in his abdomen and chest. Morrison had been lying in the open for 30 minutes. Blood loss and shock were shutting down his organs. Without intervention in the next 10 minutes, he'd be dead. Wahlen crawled, 10 yards, 20 yards. Japanese snipers saw the movement and adjusted their aim. Bullets snapped overhead. One round hit the ash 2 feet from Wahlen's head. Another tore through his pack, destroying his last bottles of plasma, but he kept moving. At 30 yards, Wahlen's right leg went completely numb. Nerve damage from the bullet wound. He couldn't feel anything below his knee anymore, just dead weight dragging behind him as he pulled himself forward with his arms. At 40 yards, a Japanese machine gun opened fire. The gunner walked his rounds toward Wahlen's position. Geysers of ash erupted in a line, getting closer, closer. Then Marines with a Browning automatic rifle suppressed the position long enough for Wahlen to cover the last 10 yards. He reached Morrison at 8:35 a.m. The Marine was barely conscious, pulse weak and thready, respiration shallow, classic signs of hypovolemic shock. Morrison needed whole blood, needed a surgeon, needed to be in a hospital, not bleeding out in volcanic ash. Wahlen had sulfanilamide powder, battle dressings, morphine. He had training and 21 days of experience treating casualties on Iwo Jima. He packed Morrison's wounds and administered morphine. Then he pulled the Marine's body close to his own, using himself as a shield against incoming fire.
Other corpsmen saw what was happening. Pharmacist's mate First Class James Chen had been treating casualties 200 yards away. He grabbed his medical kit and started running toward Wahlen's position. Japanese fire intensified immediately. Chen made it 30 yards before machine gun rounds forced him into cover. Marines tried to provide suppressive fire, but Japanese positions were too well fortified. Concrete pillboxes, steel doors that opened to fire and closed for protection, interlocking fields of fire that covered every approach. The defensive system Colonel Nakagawa had built into Iwo Jima was nearly perfect. At 8:45 a.m., Fox Company's commander called for artillery support. 15 minutes later, 105mm howitzers from the 5th Marine Division Artillery began pounding the Japanese defensive line. High explosive shells walked through the enemy positions. Smoke and debris filled the air. Under cover of the barrage, 4 Marines reached Wahlen's position with a stretcher. They loaded Morrison first. Then they tried to load Wahlen. The corpsman refused. There were still wounded Marines in the kill zone. 11 men he'd treated earlier. They needed evacuation. Someone had to coordinate their movement to the rear. The Marines argued for 10 seconds. Then they gave up. You couldn't reason with Wahlen. They'd been trying for a week. The man had been shot 3 times and was still refusing evacuation. Logic didn't apply anymore. They took Morrison back at 9 a.m. Wahlen stayed in the ash, coordinating stretcher teams. His right leg was useless. His back was on fire. His left eye socket throbbed. But 11 Marines needed help, and he was the only corpsman in position to provide it. Between 9 a.m. and 9:30 a.m., stretcher teams evacuated 8 of the 11 wounded Marines. The other 3 were dead. Wahlen had tried to save them, but they'd lost too much blood before he could reach them. Arterial bleeding, catastrophic trauma. Some wounds were beyond even the best medical treatment. At 9:40 a.m., another corpsman finally reached Wahlen's position. Pharmacist's mate Second Class Robert Hayes, the same corpsman who'd tried to evacuate Wahlen after the first grenade blast on February 26th. Hayes looked at Wahlen's leg and didn't say anything. Words weren't necessary. They both knew what came next. Hayes got Wahlen onto a stretcher at 9:50 a.m. This time the corpsman didn't argue. He'd finally reached the point where he physically couldn't continue. 3 gunshot wounds, multiple shrapnel wounds. His right leg wouldn't support weight. His left eye was destroyed. His back wounds were severely infected. 4 Marines carried the stretcher toward the battalion aid station. Wahlen lost consciousness halfway there. Blood loss and shock finally overwhelmed his system. By the time they reached medical personnel at 10:15 a.m., his pulse was barely palpable. Blood pressure critically low. The doctors weren't sure he'd survive the next hour. But George Wahlen had one advantage the doctors didn't know about yet. He'd spent the last week watching Marines fight through impossible situations. He'd seen men with catastrophic wounds refuse to quit. He'd learned that survival wasn't always about the severity of your injuries. Sometimes it was about deciding you weren't done yet. The doctors started emergency treatment at 10:20 a.m. on March 3, 1945. They had no idea what was about to happen next. Navy surgeons at the battalion aid station stabilized Wahlen enough for evacuation. By 11 a.m. on March 3rd,
He was on a landing craft heading to a hospital ship offshore. The USS Samaritan took him directly to surgery. 3 hours of operations. Doctors removed shrapnel from his leg and back. They couldn't save his left eye. The grenade blast on February 26th had destroyed too much tissue. The numbers told the story. Between February 19th and March 3rd, Fox Company sustained 183 casualties. Wahlen personally treated 67 Marines under fire. 14 of those were the men he'd saved on March 3rd after being shot in the leg. All 14 survived. Battalion medical officers calculated that without Wahlen's intervention, at least 9 would have died from blood loss before stretcher teams could reach them. The broader statistics were equally stark. Of 1,500 Navy corpsmen who landed on Iwo Jima, 332 were killed in action. Another 659 were wounded. Corpsmen died at nearly twice the rate of the Marines they served. Despite these losses, corpsmen kept answering the call. Wahlen's story spread through the 5th Marine Division like electricity. 20 years old, 3 gunshot wounds, refused evacuation twice, crawled 50 yards to reach wounded Marines, pharmacist's mate. Third-class Donald Patterson was treating casualties with the 27th Marines when he heard the story. Patterson had been considering requesting transfer to a rear echelon unit. But if Wahlen could keep working after being shot 3 times, Patterson could finish his deployment on the front line. Similar stories played out across the division. Corpsmen who were exhausted found new energy. One 20-year-old from Utah had shown them what was possible when you refused to quit. Wahlen spent 9 months in military hospitals. Guam, Hawaii, Oakland Naval Hospital. Multiple surgeries, physical therapy, and nightmares every night. Marines screaming for corpsmen, grenade blasts, the smell of blood and volcanic ash. Then something unexpected arrived that changed everything. On October 5, 1945, George Wahlen stood on the south lawn of the White House. President Harry Truman prepared to present the Medal of Honor. 14 servicemen received the medal that day, all for Iwo Jima. Truman read Wahlen's citation aloud. Wounded 3 times, refused evacuation twice, crawled 50 yards with a useless leg to save 14 Marines under continuous fire. Wahlen answered reporters' questions politely but briefly. He didn't feel like a hero. The real heroes were the Marines who died on Iwo Jima, the corpsmen who didn't make it home. The nightmares gradually faded. Meeting his future wife, Melba, helped. They married in 1946. The nightmares stopped completely after the wedding. In 1948, Wahlen re-enlisted, this time in the United States Army as a medical technician. He served in Korea, then Vietnam, in 1967 as a medical officer, wounded again. His 4th Purple Heart. He retired in 1968 after 20 years across 3 wars. Worked for the Veterans Administration for another decade. In 2004, President Bush signed legislation renaming the Salt Lake City 5A Medical Center after him. Federal buildings couldn't normally bear names of living persons. Congress made an exception. Wahlen passed away June 5, 2009, age 84, Utah's last living Medal of Honor recipient. Over 2,000 people attended his memorial service. 4 Navy corpsmen received the Medal of Honor for Iwo Jima. 2 died in combat. 2 survived. Between them, they showed an entire generation what was possible when you refused to accept that casualties were lost. 14 Marines survived March 3rd because a 20-year-old crawled 50 yards with a bullet in his leg. And thousands of corpsmen over the following 80 years learned what devotion to duty looked like. If this story resonated with you the way it resonated with us, I need you to do something right now. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube's algorithm to push this story in front of more people who need to hear it. Hit subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on notifications. We're pulling forgotten stories out of dusty archives every single day. Stories about corpsmen who saved lives with plasma and courage. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia. Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure George Wahlen doesn't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.